What happens when trust turns into a deadly game? She thought she was safe. She thought she had escaped him. But the night isn't over, and neither is the terror. Watch till the end to see how one woman's fight for survival becomes a nightmare beyond her worst fears. Will she make it out alive? Or will he catch her before the dawn? Stay with us. You won't believe how this story ends. The house was silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan. She sat on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, scrolling through her phone. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, from the candles she always lit in the evenings. Outside, the crickets chirped, their song steady and unbroken. The warm glow of the table lamp cast soft shadows on the walls. It felt peaceful. It had always felt this way with him. He entered the room, his steps deliberate, almost too slow. She looked up and smiled, her eyes lighting up as they always did. But he didn't smile back. His face was blank, unreadable, a mask that made her stomach tighten. He carried something in his hands, wrapped in a towel. She tilted her head, curious, but not yet concerned. "What's that?" she asked, her voice light. He didn't answer. Instead, he set it down on the coffee table, carefully, like it was fragile. The towel shifted slightly, revealing a glint of steel beneath the fabric. Her heart skipped a beat. She sat up straighter, her pulse quickening. "What is it?" she asked again, this time with a slight tremor in her voice. He looked at her, his eyes colder than she'd ever seen them. There was something unsettling in his gaze, something unfamiliar. She felt the air grow heavier, the silence between them thick and suffocating. The sound of the fan seemed louder now, slicing through the tension like a blade. "I need you to trust me," he said finally, his voice low and devoid of emotion. Her chest tightened. This wasn't the man she knew. This wasn't the man she had married. The candle flickered, casting eerie shapes across his face. She wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but fear held her tongue. He unwrapped the towel, revealing what lay inside. Her breath caught, and her world tilted. The object gleamed under the lamp's light, sharp, menacing. She recoiled, her back pressing against the couch. "What are you doing?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He stepped closer. The crickets outside stopped chirping. The silence outside felt deafening now, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the faint hum of the fan. The object in his hand, a knife, long and wickedly sharp, gleamed like a predator's tooth. Her voice broke as she stammered, Why do you have that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head, studying her like she was something fragile, something breakable. "I told you to trust me," he said again, his tone chilling in its calmness. Her eyes darted toward the door, calculating the distance. Could she make it? Would he stop her? She tried to steady her breathing, to force the rising panic back down. But it was no use. The weight of his gaze pinned her in place. "I love you," he said suddenly, his voice softer now, almost tender. It didn't feel like love. It felt like a threat. Her mind raced, searching for an explanation or reason. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. "Put it down," she said, her voice cracking. He didn't move. The knife stayed in his grip, steady, deliberate. "I have to show you something," he said, stepping closer. Her hands clutched the edge of the couch, her nails digging into the fabric. "What is wrong with you?" she cried, her voice rising. Still, he advanced, each step slow and deliberate. She could see the tension in his jaw, the way his knuckles whitened around the hilt of the blade. The lavender candle sputtered, its flame shrinking, as if the room itself was suffocating. Her eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, she could use. A vase on the table. A pair of scissors near her sketchpad. But they felt so far away now. His shadow loomed over her, stretching across the room like a dark omen. "Don't fight me," he murmured, his tone almost pleading. But there was no kindness in his eyes. Only something cold. Something final. She bolted. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, throwing herself off the couch and toward the door. But he was faster. His hand clamped around her wrist, yanking her back with terrifying strength. She screamed. It echoed through the house, piercing and desperate. "Stop," he yelled, his voice suddenly filled with rage. Her knees buckled, her heart pounding as if it would burst. The knife glinted in his other hand, raised just slightly. For a moment, everything froze. Time hung suspended, the world reduced to the two of them and the weapon between them. And then he smiled. But it wasn't his smile. It was something else entirely. The smile sent a shiver down her spine, colder than the steel in his hand. Her legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand her ground. Her mind screamed at her to fight, to flee, to do anything but stay frozen. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. His grip on her wrist tightened, the pressure biting into her skin. The smile lingered, cruel and detached, as if he were savoring the moment. "I never wanted it to be like this," he said, his tone eerily calm. Her breath hitched, the words striking her like a physical blow. "What are you talking about?" she managed to choke out. His eyes bore into hers, unblinking, unrelenting. "You always wanted honesty, didn't you?" he said, almost mockingly. The knife shifted in his hand, catching the dim light as he tilted it. "Honesty about what?" she asked, her voice trembling. His expression darkened, the playful edge fading. "You don't really know me," he said, almost to himself. His words felt like ice, slicing through the fragile thread of trust she still clung to. "You're scaring me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," he replied, his voice chillingly flat. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in as the air grew heavier. She thought of their life together, the moments that felt so perfect. All of it felt like a distant memory, something that belonged to someone else. Her gaze flickered to the door again, the escape just out of reach. He noticed. "Don't," he warned, his tone sharp, the knife rising slightly. She froze again, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "Because I have no choice," he said, as if that explained everything. Tears welled in her eyes, her vision blurring as she struggled to comprehend. "This isn't you," she said, desperation lacing her words. He laughed, low and bitter. "Maybe it is," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Her knees felt weak, her body swaying as the weight of his words pressed down on her. The knife gleamed brighter now, a sinister promise of what was to come. The lavender candle extinguished itself, plunging the room into a suffocating darkness. The darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the faint glow from the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Her breathing was ragged, shallow, each inhale a struggle against the suffocating tension. She could hear the faint creak of the floorboards as he shifted his weight. The knife, no longer glinting in the light, became a shadow in his hand. She tried to focus, to find his silhouette in the gloom, but the dark seemed alive, twisting around him. "Do you feel it now?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Feel what?" she croaked, her throat tight with fear. "The truth," he said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. His presence felt enormous now, pressing in from every side. Her heart hammered in her chest, the sound so loud, she thought he could hear it too. She backed up, her hands fumbling against the wall behind her, searching for a switch, a weapon, anything. His voice cut through the silence again, closer this time. "You always wanted everything to be perfect," he said, his tone laced with bitterness. "And when it wasn't, you pretended. You ignored the cracks." Her fingers found the edge of a picture frame, trembling as she gripped it tightly. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, anger bubbling beneath her terror. I gave you everything. His laugh echoed, hollow and sharp, a sound that didn't belong to the man she thought she knew.
No, he said.
You gave yourself everything. The words hit her like a slap, and for a moment, confusion overtook fear. What does that even mean? She demanded, her voice rising. You think you know someone, he muttered, more to himself now. Years together. Smiles. Promises. He took another step forward, the knife now a darker shadow against his silhouette. And yet you never saw me, he hissed. Her grip tightened on the picture frame, her knuckles white. I see you now, she said, her voice trembling but firm. And you're a monster. That word stopped him, just for a moment. A flicker of something, regret? Pain, crossed his face. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He lunged. Without thinking, she swung the picture frame, the glass shattering on impact. The sound exploded in the dark, a violent cacophony that sent shards scattering. He stumbled back, cursing, clutching his face. She didn't wait. Her body moved instinctively, bolting toward the door, her bare feet crunching on broken glass. Behind her, his voice roared, filled with rage and something else. Something primal. Get back here. But she didn't look back. The door loomed ahead, salvation just within reach. Her fingers closed around the handle, and she yanked it open, the cold night air rushing in like a lifeline. She ran, the shadows of the night swallowing her whole. The icy air stung her skin as she bolted into the darkness, her bare feet pounding against the gravel of the driveway. The world outside was eerily quiet, save for the frantic thudding of her heart in her ears. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, clouds of mist forming in the cold night air. Behind her, the door slammed open with a deafening crash. His shadow spilled out onto the porch, tall and menacing under the pale glow of the moon. Come back, he bellowed, his voice carrying across the empty yard like a warning. She didn't stop. Her body screamed in protest, her soul stinging from the sharp stones beneath her. But fear drove her forward, every instinct screaming at her to keep moving. She darted toward the woods, their dark embrace both terrifying and promising refuge. The branches clawed at her arms as she plunged into the thicket, leaves crunching beneath her hurried steps. The dense trees swallowed her whole, their canopy blocking out the faint moonlight. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, and fell hard onto the forest floor. Pain shot through her palms as they scraped against the rough earth. But she bit back the cry rising in her throat, forcing herself to stay silent. Behind her, she could hear him crashing through the undergrowth, relentless in his pursuit. Stop running, he shouted, his voice sharp with fury. She scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling but refusing to give up. The knife. She could hear it, the faint metallic rasp as it scraped against the branches he pushed aside. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them away, her focus sharp on the narrow path ahead. Her mind raced, searching for a plan, a way out. But the woods stretched endlessly, the shadows swallowing every direction. Suddenly, the sound of his footsteps grew louder, closer. She veered off the path, plunging deeper into the trees, her breath shallow and rapid. The forest closed in around her, the darkness growing thicker with every step. Her pulse thundered as she glanced back, just for a second. His figure loomed in the distance, his pace unrelenting. She bit her lip to keep from crying out, her body trembling with exhaustion and terror. Then, she saw it, a faint glimmer ahead, barely perceptible through the dense foliage. A light, faint and flickering, like the promise of salvation. She pushed herself harder, her body screaming in protest. The light grew brighter, steadier, until she burst into a clearing. It was a cabin, small and weathered, with a single lamp glowing in the window. She didn't hesitate. Her fists pounded on the door, the sound echoing into the quiet night. "Help!" she cried, her voice cracking. "Please, someone?" The door creaked open, revealing a figure standing in the dim light. An older man, his face etched with lines of time and worry. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. Before she could answer, a rustle came from the trees behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. He was there, stepping into the clearing, the knife gleaming once more under the light of the cabin. The older man's eyes widened as he caught sight of the figure stepping into the clearing. The knife in his hand glinted like a predator's fang, its presence unmistakable. The older man's hand instinctively moved to the doorframe, gripping it tightly. "Who is that?" he demanded, his voice steady but tinged with caution. She couldn't speak. Her throat felt dry, her voice lost to the fear coursing through her. Her pursuer stepped closer, his face now visible under the faint glow of the cabin's light. "Stay out of this," he said coldly, his tone sharp and commanding. The older man glanced between them, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "She's terrified," the man said, his voice hardening. "Drop T. The knife." Her pursuer smiled, a twisted, almost mocking grin spreading across his face. "This isn't your concern," he said, taking another step forward. The older man didn't move from the doorway. "It is now," he said, his voice firm. "You've got 2 seconds to put that down, or I'm calling the cops." Her pursuer's expression darkened, the smugness slipping away. "No one's calling anyone," he hissed, his grip tightening on the blade. The older man reached into his pocket, pulling out a phone, his movements deliberate. "I mean it," he said. "One call, and this is over." The tension crackled like electricity in the air. She stood frozen, her body trembling, unsure whether to run or stay rooted in place. Her pursuer's gaze flicked to her, his eyes burning with something unreadable. "You think they'll get here in time?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. The older man didn't flinch. "Try me," he said, his thumb hovering over the phone screen. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. The clearing was deathly silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Her pursuer shifted his weight, his body tense, as if preparing to lunge. And then, without warning, the older man stepped back into the cabin. The door slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the night. A heavy click followed, the sound of a lock sliding into place. Her heart sank. "Coward," her pursuer shouted, his voice echoing in the clearing. But then she realized, the man hadn't abandoned her. From inside the cabin, she could hear a muffled voice speaking quickly. He was on the phone. Her pursuer realized it too. His head snapped toward her, his eyes wild with rage. "You see what you've done," he growled, his voice low and venomous. She took a step back, her body trembling as the reality of the moment hit her. He moved toward her, faster now, his steps deliberate and deadly. She turned, her legs barely obeying her as she bolted for the woods again. But she knew. This time, there might be no escape. The woods closed in around her once more, a labyrinth of shadows and tangled branches. Her legs burned, every step a fight against exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear him. His footsteps crashed through the undergrowth, faster, angrier. "You can't run forever," he bellowed, his voice slicing through the night. The cold air clawed at her lungs, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Her mind raced, grasping for options, for a way out of the endless darkness. Ahead, the trees thinned slightly, revealing a faint shimmer through the gaps. Water. A river or a stream. She couldn't tell. It didn't matter. It was her only chance. She pushed herself harder, her body screaming in protest, until she broke through the treeline. The river stretched out before her, wide and fast-moving, its surface reflecting the pale light of the moon. The current roared, a symphony of chaos that drowned out everything else. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her mind torn between fear and desperation. Behind her, His footsteps grew louder. Closer. Don't do it, he yelled, his voice laced with fury and something else. Panic. She didn't think. She jumped. The icy water swallowed her whole, the shock of it stealing her breath. The current was stronger than she'd expected, pulling her under, spinning her like a rag doll. Her arms flailed, her lungs burning as she fought to surface. When she broke through, gasping for air, she saw him standing on the bank. His silhouette loomed against the darkness, the knife still glinting in his hand. He paced the edge, his rage palpable, but he didn't follow. The river was too strong, too dangerous, even for him. She let the current carry her, her body battered and freezing but alive. The roar of the water drowned out his shouts, his figure growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared altogether. Her limbs felt like lead, her strength fading as the river swept her away. The world blurred, the edges of her vision darkening as exhaustion overtook her. And then, she saw it, a stretch of calmer water ahead, bordered by a rocky bank. Summoning the last of her strength, she kicked and paddled, the current fighting her every inch of the way. Finally, she reached the edge, her fingers grasping at the slick rocks as she dragged herself onto solid ground. She collapsed, her body trembling violently, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. The night was silent now, save for the distant rush of the river. She lay there, her mind blank, her body numb. But she was alive. For now. The jagged rocks beneath her dug into her skin, but she didn't care. The only thing that mattered was the stillness. The absence of his voice. The absence of his footsteps. Her limbs felt like lead, too heavy to move, but her ears strained to pick up any sound. Any sign he might still be near. The river's roar faded behind her, replaced by the rustling of the forest in the gentle night breeze. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its call haunting in the silence. She forced herself to sit up, her body screaming in protest. Her clothes clung to her, soaked and heavy, her hair plastered to her face. Her arms were scratched, her knees bloodied, but the pain felt distant. She turned her head slowly, scanning the treeline for movement. Nothing. For the first time in what felt like hours, she exhaled deeply, her breath shaky and uneven. Her mind began to race again, replaying everything that had happened. His smile, the glint of the knife, the way his voice had shifted, becoming something alien, something she didn't recognize. The memories made her stomach churn, but she shoved them aside. She couldn't afford to break down. Not yet. Not here. She needed to move, to find shelter, to put as much distance as possible between herself and him. But where? The forest stretched endlessly around her, a maze of shadows and whispers. Her fingers brushed against something cold and jagged, the rocks along the riverbank. She turned toward the water, her reflection barely visible in the rippling surface. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and wild, a stranger staring back at her. For a moment, she thought of the cabin. The older man. Did he call the police? Would they find her? Or had her pursuer silenced him, too? The thought made her stomach lurch, but she couldn't dwell on it. A snapping twig jolted her from her thoughts, her body going rigid. Her head whipped around, her heart pounding as she stared into the darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. She listened, her breath held, every muscle tensed. And then, faintly, she heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming closer. Her blood turned to ice as she scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. He had found her. Somehow, he had followed her. And now he was here. She backed away from the sound, her bare feet slipping on the slick rocks. The forest felt alive, the shadows shifting and closing in around her. Another sound, a low, chilling laugh. It echoed through the trees, taunting her, making her heart race faster. "You can't hide," his voice called out, cold and sharp. "Not from me." Panic surged through her veins as she turned and ran, her body fueled by sheer terror. The forest swallowed her once again, the branches tearing at her skin. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Not until she was free. Or dead. The forest was a labyrinth, endless and unyielding, each tree a towering silhouette against the faint moonlight. Her breath came in short, desperate gasps, the cold air burning her throat. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, steady and unrelenting. He wasn't running.
He didn't have to.
He knew she was tiring, her body wearing down with each frantic step. "Keep running," his voice taunted from somewhere behind her. "It only makes this more fun." The words sliced through her like a blade, her fear fueling her legs to move faster. But the terrain was unforgiving, the uneven ground threatening to trip her with every step. Her foot caught on a root, and she went down hard, her body slamming into the dirt. Pain exploded in her knee, and she bit her lip to stifle a scream. The coppery taste of blood filled her mouth, sharp and bitter. For a moment, she lay there, her chest heaving, the forest spinning around her. The footsteps slowed, the sound of his approach deliberate and measured. She turned her head, her vision blurring with tears and terror. Through the darkness, she could see his figure emerging from the shadows. The knife in his hand gleamed faintly, catching the sliver of moonlight filtering through the trees. She clawed at the ground, her nails digging into the dirt as she tried to pull herself up. But her body betrayed her, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. He stopped a few feet away, his face obscured in the shadows. For a moment, neither of them moved, the night holding its breath. "Did you really think you could get away from me?" he asked, his voice low and mocking. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a deafening drum. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He tilted his head, as if considering her plea. "Please," she repeated, louder this time, the word trembling on her lips. His silence was more terrifying than his words, the weight of it pressing down on her. And then, he crouched, bringing himself closer, his eyes glinting with something unhinged. "You don't understand," he murmured, his voice almost tender. "This isn't about hate." He reached out, the blade catching the light as he moved it closer to her. "This is about love." She flinched, her body recoiling as he drew nearer, his presence suffocating. Her fingers brushed against something cold and solid, a rock, jagged and heavy. Her grip tightened around it, her breath catching as she made her decision. He didn't notice, his focus entirely on her, his expression dark with resolve. "Goodbye," he whispered, his voice almost soft. She swung the rock with every ounce of strength she had left. It connected with a sickening thud, the force of the impact jolting through her arm. He stumbled back, a guttural cry escaping his lips as he dropped the knife. Without hesitating, she scrambled to her feet, ignoring the searing pain in her leg. Grabbing the knife, she turned and ran, her vision blurred with tears, her heart racing with a new kind of terror. This time, she wasn't running to escape. She was running to survive. The forest blurred around her as she ran, her pulse hammering in her ears, louder than the sounds of the night. Her hands gripped the knife with a desperation she hadn't known she was capable of. Every step felt like a struggle, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't look back. Behind her, she could hear him stumbling, cursing, trying to recover from the blow. But she didn't care. She couldn't afford to care. The trees seemed to close in on her, the branches scratching at her skin, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath her feet. She pushed herself harder, her body screaming in protest, but the fear of him was stronger. Her breath came in jagged gasps, her lungs burning with the cold air as she tore through the woods. And then, ahead, she saw it, a clearing, a break in the trees. The faint glow of lights flickered through the underbrush, just beyond reach. A house. She didn't hesitate. She bolted toward it, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the sanctuary of safety. The house loomed closer, its silhouette sharp against the dark sky. Her heart surged with a flicker of hope. Almost there. But then, as if summoned by her thoughts, a voice rang out behind her. "You're not getting away from me," he spat, his voice filled with venom. She felt his presence close, too close. The next instant, his hand shot out, grabbing her arm with a vice-like grip, jerking her to a halt. The knife slipped from her hand, landing in the dirt with a soft thud. Her pulse surged with terror, but she acted on pure instinct. Twisting in his grasp, she brought her elbow back, slamming it into his ribs. He grunted, loosening his hold just enough for her to break free. She darted forward, her feet slamming against the earth, pushing through the pain, the exhaustion. Her hand found the door handle to the house, and with all her remaining strength, she wrenched it open. The door creaked loudly, but she didn't care. She stumbled inside, her body falling against the cool wooden floor. The moment the door slammed shut behind her, a rush of panic overwhelmed her. She wasn't safe. Not yet. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes wild, her breath ragged. The house was dark, silent, but she could sense movement beyond the walls. Her mind raced. Was this the end? Would he break in, drag her back into the night? The sound of the door handle rattling broke her thoughts. Her heart lurched in her chest, and she backed away, her body tense. Her eyes searched the dark corners of the room, looking for anything that could help. Her hands found the edge of a chair, the wood smooth beneath her fingers. There was no time to think. She grabbed the chair, her hands gripping the legs with desperation, ready to defend herself. The rattling of the door grew louder, more frantic.
"And tea."
Then it stopped. Silence. She held her breath, waiting for what would come next. But there was only stillness. The tension in the room stretched long, unbearable. Minutes passed, or was it seconds? Her mind felt detached from her body, each movement slow, as if her very existence was suspended in time. And then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible scrape of something sharp against the wood. The knife. He had it again, and he was closer than ever. The scrape of the blade against the door was like a signal, a warning. He was there. She could almost feel his presence creeping through the wood, like an animal stalking its prey. Her body tensed, muscles coiling with fear and adrenaline. She glanced around the room, her eyes wild, searching for any escape. The window. It was her only chance. But the moment she turned, she heard the door creak, a slow, menacing sound as it began to give way. Her heart skipped a beat. She bolted for the window, the room spinning as panic consumed her. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, her breath coming in desperate gasps. She needed to move faster. Faster. The door groaned, then slammed open, the sound deafening in the otherwise quiet house. "Don't run." His voice rang out, low and threatening. She didn't have time to look back. The window was finally open, and she dove through, feeling the sharp sting of the cold air as she plunged into the night. Her body hit the ground with a painful thud, but she didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet, disoriented, the world a blur around her. His footsteps followed, relentless and fast. She took off again, ignoring the searing pain in her legs, her heart hammering in her chest. The woods. The shelter of the trees was her only hope now. The thought barely registered before she was diving back into the darkness, the trees swallowing her whole once more. The moonlight barely touched the ground, leaving her stumbling through the shadows. Her breaths were shallow and ragged, the air thick with terror and cold. Behind her, she could hear him, the sound of his pursuit unwavering. She tried to run faster, but her body was betraying her. Her limbs were heavy, sluggish, her energy drained from the endless flight. Her mind screamed for her to keep moving, to not stop. She couldn't let him catch her. But then she heard something else. A distant noise, like a car's engine. Her heart leapt. Could it be? Could someone be coming? The sound grew louder, closer. A vehicle, definitely. She pushed harder, her body aching with the effort. The sound of the engine was her only guide now, her hope that someone, anyone, might save her from the nightmare she couldn't escape. But as she reached the edge of the clearing, her foot caught on something, another root, another trap. She fell forward, crashing to the ground, her vision blurring. Her hands scraped against the dirt, her palms raw, but she didn't stop. The engine roared closer, closer. But then another sound, a different noise, the unmistakable hiss of a blade being drawn from its sheath. Her blood ran cold. He was right behind her again. Her breath hitched as the sound of the blade sliced through the air behind her. She tried to push herself up, but her legs refused to obey, the weight of exhaustion dragging her down. Every inch of her body screamed for rest, but she knew if she stopped, if she gave in, it would be over. The hiss of the blade grew louder, closer, until she felt his presence hovering over her like a dark shadow. She forced herself to crawl, her fingers scraping against the dirt as she tried to inch toward the edge of the clearing. The sound of the car engine was still there, but it felt so far away now, as if the world had shrunk into nothing but him and her. His footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one carrying a finality that made her skin crawl. "You're mine," his voice whispered, cold and low, sending a chill down her spine. The fear was suffocating, but something inside her stirred, a flicker of defiance. She couldn't let him win. Not like this. With all the strength she could summon, she twisted around, the knife in her hand shaking but steady. The moment he stepped closer, she thrust it forward, the motion fueled by pure instinct. The blade sank deep, the impact sending a jolt through her arm, through her very core. He gasped, a sound that was half a grunt and half a choking breath. She didn't stop. She pressed harder, her vision blurring as the weight of the moment took over. His grip on her faltered, his body swaying as the blood began to spill. Her hands were shaking, the knife slick with his blood, but she didn't let go. With one final push, she forced him back, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. She didn't wait. Her feet finally found the strength to run again. The car engine was so close now, and this time, she wasn't going to let it slip away. She stumbled toward the sound, her legs barely holding her up, but she didn't stop. And then, lights. A car's headlights pierced through the darkness, illuminating the clearing ahead. Her vision swam, but she saw them. A figure in the driver's seat. "Help! Please!" she screamed, her voice raw and desperate. The car screeched to a halt. The door swung open. A hand reached out, pulling her inside, away from the nightmare. She collapsed into the seat, tears streaming down her face, her body trembling with relief. But in the distance, a shadow lingered, his figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching. For now, she was safe. But she knew this was far from over. The car sped away, its tires kicking up dirt and gravel as they tore through the night. She didn't know how long it had been since she last felt the warmth of safety, but the familiar hum of the engine beneath her gave her a strange comfort. The air inside the car was warm, the faint scent of leather and fresh air grounding her as she sank back against the seat. Her heart was still racing, her mind a blur of fragmented thoughts. The terror, the chase, the endless running, it all felt like a distant nightmare she had just woken from. But she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. The figure in the distance, standing motionless in the shadows, it haunted her. A glance to the driver, a kind face full of concern, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. Her throat felt tight, her words caught behind the storm of emotions that threatened to overtake her. "Are you okay?" the driver asked, his voice gentle, filled with care. She nodded, but her hands trembled, her body still locked in fight-or-flight mode. She wasn't sure if she'd ever be okay again. The road stretched out ahead of them, long and dark, leading toward some kind of refuge, toward safety, toward the unknown. But in her mind, the forest, the man, everything felt so close, as if they were just a breath away. The car passed a sign, "Welcome to the city," but it did little to ease the ache inside her. For a moment, she let herself close her eyes, the faint hum of the car and the rhythmic beat of her heart blending into a lullaby of exhaustion. Her body felt drained, numb, but her mind kept racing. She knew the man wouldn't stop. Not until he had her. But for now, she was alive. She wasn't dead. She hadn't lost. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself a small, fleeting moment of peace. A deep breath. A glimmer of hope. The night was still long, and the road ahead uncertain. But as the city lights flickered on the horizon, she clung to the one truth she could trust. She would keep fighting, because survival was her choice.